Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRS Sports Podcast, episode 64. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, and so much going on. It's a great time of the sports calendar. We've got so much to discuss as the Masters are underway, the MLB season is underway, NBA playoffs are right around the corner. But first, be a pro and win with DRF Sports Pro, introducing DRF Sports, all new premium data feature on drf.com/sports. For $99 a year, which is just $8.25 a month, you can get industry-leading betting trends, angles, and analytics. With so many big sporting events going on, it's the best way for you to make some money and have fun while doing it. That's DRF Sports Pro. Sign up now at drf.com/sports. And hopefully we will keep up with the pro picks as well. We'll talk a little Tiger as he gets underway at the Masters. We'll recap the Natty as Kansas won. Of course, we'll break down some NBA action with the playoffs almost here and some NBA picks for tonight's action as well. For all of that, my guy Matt Russell joins us, and that starts right about now. Well, it's a great time of the sports calendar, that's for sure. And a busy week here on the DRS Sports Podcast, hitting you up with our normal 2 pods a week, plus a Masters preview, plus an MLB preview. And we're still here cooking it up again for another pod. I mean, my head's kind of spinning because there's so much sports going on. So I guess my question is, Mr. Matt Russell, what are you most excited about right now on Thursday morning? Even though I think I know the answer to this.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest, right? Last we spoke, it was still sort of a maybe, though. You know, as we mentioned, if you could get a bet down on Tiger Woods to play in the Masters, absolutely do so, because right now I am nuclear about 10:34 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, maybe when you're listening to this, Tiger is probably bogeyed the first, because even at the best of times, he would bogey the first at Augusta National. So nobody freak out, nobody panic if that ends up being the case. He's obviously won the tournament by shooting plus 440 on the front nine back in 1997. So again, let's try not to freak out there. Let's try not to freak out. Let's try not to just have any expectations for our guy here, right? And so the one thing I would say about Tiger is, listen, as much as everybody has been, this has been the hot topic in betting circles, right? Like, oh, look at all these idiots betting Tiger Woods to win the Masters. And like, yeah, I mean, I'm not looking to bet him to win it either, because first of all, like, what's the amount of money that I could bet that is going to make it sort of relevant or more relevant to just how much I would enjoy watching him with the all-time comeback in the history of sports. Versus like, okay, am I going to bet that much money on something that has a really, really small chance of happening? But the point is like, Tiger's been overvalued his whole life, right? In quotation marks, right? Like, this is a guy who, again, when he was 21, he lapped the field at the Masters. Like, the value was sucked out in April of 1997. This is a guy who was like 3-1 odds on basically every major for like the next 10 years, right? Like, there's never been value betting on Tiger Woods, but you know what? Hasn't really mattered a lot of the times, right? And even in 2019, you bet on Tiger then, you seemed, somewhat foolish at that time, but winning a bet on Tiger Woods that year would have paid off for a lot of the, foolish bets from the previous years, and certainly a handful of foolish bets going forward. So I don't begrudge the people of wanting to do it. It is this situation, though, where you look and you go, man, sportsbooks must love this, because they can post whatever number they want on Tiger and they're going to take money and have very little chance of risk. Obviously, if he wins, we'll get those reports on how all these sportsbooks took a bath. But unlike early in the 2000s, right, he didn't have the competition back then. And he's got the competition now. This field is strong as it's ever been. But I'm just glad that he's out there. I'm just happy to watch this all unfold. It's certainly added an extra hop in my step over the course of this week.
Yeah, it's super interesting reminder that sometimes lines and odds aren't based on the probability. It's based on what kind of money you can get in terms of people paying on it or betting on it. So that part's super interesting to me. Masters, obviously a lot more interesting with Tiger involved than without Tiger involved. So exactly. Looking forward to that this weekend for sure. Something that is in our rear view in Masters Week, obviously, is a national title game. As Kansas pulls off the victory as they win 72-69, pulling off a 16-point comeback, which is the largest comeback in championship game history. And if we remember, the line was around 4.5, somewhere around there. And the funniest part to me about this game was you look up at the very end and my guy steps out of bounds and there's a review. It's a 3-point game. And you're like, there's a lot of money that's going to switch hands based off of this review. And then they're showing the replay and you see my guy stepped out of bounds, not once, but twice. Yeah. So not even these officials could mess that up, you would think. So, but even with that said, I'm still sitting there like, I'm not really sure how this is going to play out. But either way, Kansas wins. Bill Self, cool. What's your biggest takeaway from the national championship game?
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about it. I was on -4 with Kansas. And so part of what we need to do as bettors is, whether it's a Tuesday game in February or random football game or whatever, you want to go back and go, okay, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? And why did we get things wrong? And you and I talk about all the time, like when we get things right, we kind of just brush past it because we go, okay, yeah, like we were correct about all of that. And it doesn't do us any good to do like 5 to 10 minutes on the podcast about what we were right about, right? I mean, occasionally we do, especially when it comes to big games where you have to, have a look back at things. When it comes to this game, we talked about the short spread for a game with a total of 152.5, right? And the difference between betting a team that's, -4 in a game that's expected to be in these, 130s, if you will, right? And if a game is expected to be in the 150s, you get a larger disparity of what could possibly happen, right? And like the point distribution. So a 6-point game is a lot closer when there's 150 points in the game than when a 6-point game when there's 130 points, right? Just percentages, right? So, I look at this and I go, okay, the game goes way under in this game total of 152.5, right? This game goes, pretty comfortably under. So looking back, okay, how are we going to evaluate this game? And again, it's -4, like you mentioned, right? Harris steps out of bounds. That's maybe the difference between this game covering. And honestly, I would have been a lot more comfortable if he steps out or if he, doesn't step out of bounds, they foul, he goes down, he makes however many free throws he was going to make. And then North Carolina comes back and gets some like meaningless bucket at the end to backdoor. Like I would have been way more at ease with that because I'm like, yeah, that's why we bet more underdogs than we do favorites, because when it comes down to those late game coin flips, and listen, we talk about lines being tight, nothing tighter than that situation, right? Where it's a 3-point game, a 4-point spread. And in theory, we're going to the line, barring some sort of absurd inbounds play call. So, we know that these things come down to a 50-50 thing, but most often, right, the losing team is going to get that last bucket. So I would have been okay if that had been the circumstance. But when I look at it, I go, okay, who left more points on the table? Why, when I'm looking at evaluating the point spread here, it's more about evaluating the total of the game, because when the total comes up so short, right, 11.5 points, you go, who was at fault for that? And I don't know if you need the eye test, I don't know if you need the metrics and all of this, right? But I think it's fair to say that Kansas left more points on the table, right? Where their free throw shooting was pretty atrocious, 8 of 14 from the free throw line, and they missed an absolute ton of layups. There were 4 of 12 in the first half in layups, and that's something that they hit about 64% of the time, right? Like that's average. So they go 33% on something that they do 64% of the time, and all you would have needed was 1 or 2, obviously you need 1 layup in order to cover, but we'd expect maybe 50%, right? We don't expect even them to actually hit 2/3 of those layups in order for them to cover. And so when you look at the metrics, right, they score 72-69, we go, okay, what was the shot quality metrics? We love the shot quality metrics here. and the shot quality metrics were 79-68 for Kansas, right? So whether it's an eye test of going, man, like Jalen Wilson is missing a lot of layups, or man, Kansas is missing a lot of free throws, or actually sort of sitting back, having a professional evaluate this when it comes to shot quality and going like, yeah, okay, so this game was played to 79-68, but Kansas just kind of blew most of their shots. The interesting point there is that North Carolina's total was 69. Nice. And they should have had 68 points, right? Like they performed the way that we expected them to, right? And it was Kansas that was the team that wasn't able to hold their end of the bargain. So again, it's a combination of eye test, right? Anybody could sort of see that. And that's where I think people get up in arms about the sort of metrics community going like, yeah, I could have seen that Kansas missed a bunch of layups. I can see that they missed a bunch of free throws, right? Like this isn't advanced metrics quality stuff. It's like, yeah, but it's nice to at least know that with somebody who's like there to track it instead of us a couple of beers in on a Monday night, are paying attention to this type of stuff. So, I go, okay, I think we were on the right track there. Can't put the ball into the basket for them. From a prop standpoint, the other thing, 3-1 on props that I gave out over at the score. And the one that I didn't get was Braun over 12.5 points. Brown over 12.5 points. Easy to do when you're reading off a guy's name to mess it up. Over 12.5 points, and he gets 12. And doesn't, takes 1 3-pointer, doesn't hit it, doesn't get any free throws, right? He makes 6 baskets, literally like the maximum amount of baskets that you can make in order to still go under, right? And you just go like, man, that feels a little bit bad beady there, right? As well. And I don't think it was a coincidence from a game's, handicapping standpoint. We talked about the matchups and that sort of thing. And 3 of the wins, right? Abaji under, because we knew that he was going to have Leaky Black on him. Brady Manick, we knew was going to have some trouble with Jalen Wilson's length. And of course, the over on David McCormick's rebounds, because he was going up against a compromised Armando Bacot, right? And like all those 3 were relatively easy winners. Amazing that Abaji somehow wins the MOP despite comfortably going under his point total. Like you just don't see that very often. I don't think we would have gotten our Cooper Cup MVP in the Super Bowl if he had gone under his receiving total. I just look back and I go, okay, well, it can't be a coincidence, right? That Kansas got themselves back in the game when Brown took over and was able to be more assertive and go on that sort of personal run that he went on at the start of the second half. And so, it all goes back to coaching, right? Whether it's the stepping out of bounds, whether it's getting the ball in the right guy's hands. And, Jalen Wilson's playing just, not playing way too much, but, getting too many shots on offense. And then Bill Self drawing up a play. And listen, I'm not in the huddle. I don't know what Bill Self was doing as far as that play at the end of the game, whether the idea was, hey, have a guy come in a full sprint to catch the ball towards the inbounds, right? Like the inbound line, like that's just never a good idea. I just look back and I go, listen, this guy is a Mario Chalmers sort of quasi miracle 3-pointer against Memphis 14 years ago. And basically a full game, like low level catastrophe from a coaching standpoint. And he's got 2 national titles. And as we get past the sort of Roy Williams and the Coach K and, eventually some of these other guys who are retiring, like we're going to get into a point here where we're going to look around and like, it's just going to be Bill Self and Jay Wright. And like, that's the list as far as, accomplished active coaches. And like, we talk about the start of the tournament. You're like, you don't want to trust Kansas. You're like, oh man, I'm always on the wrong side with Kansas. It's like, yeah, because like Bill Self's out here making some of these decisions that these guys, that he's making. And like, we talked about the route that Kansas had and how that was fortunate for them and fortunate for anybody who had a Kansas future, of which I did. But you just go, okay, like just because that gets validated and that Kansas future cashes, next year, you and I should be having the same conversation, right? We should be having the same conversation about Bill Self, and not can he win the big one, because obviously that's absurd. He already did. But like, is this a guy we want to trust? And so next year when he gets knocked out in the second round, like we shouldn't be surprised, because this wasn't a coaching display over the entire term, right? The incredibly good path that they had, right? Obviously Villanova, one of their key players and on a pretty tight short team, gets injured. It's like it couldn't have been cooked up any easier for Self. And yeah, they make the comeback, but listen, that's what frankly the better team should do. And it's funny, you and I talked about how this season had been a lot about teams melting in the second half, and we hadn't seen those like epic comebacks. Obviously Baylor against North Carolina, speaking of, right? that was the one sort of comeback that we saw this year. And it just took till the 63rd game to have a big comeback in the second half for that sort of theme throughout the season to rear its ugly head. So all in all, a sort of a very frustrating for the, situation for those of us with -4, because, listen, North Carolina, you could say obviously right side, they had a 15-point lead. Like imagine if they hadn't covered. But Kansas goes on a 21-point run, essentially, right? Like they were up 6 in the second half. And so, yes, North Carolina gets credit for going on the run in the first half, and Kansas gets, credit for going on the run in the second half. And so it's just very much a coin flip type situation in the end that for me would have been a little bit more comfortable even if it had been a 4-point game. Like that felt like a game that probably should have just been a push, right? That should have been just a 4-point game. Everybody pushes, we all laugh at all the fun that we had, and everybody just gets their bet refunded. Would have been nice for Christian Brown to get a free throw late, maybe to put it to 4. That would have been a nice ending for everybody involved. But all in all, not the best tournament that we've ever had. Couple of really good games, and obviously when you get the bracket going and the betting going, you can have a really good time no matter how sort of mediocre the tournament is. I'm not a guy who rates the tournament on how many buzzer beaters there are. That seems like very I'm a 12-year-old type of a situation, right? Like I don't need that for basketball to be good. But all in all, it was a tournament, and we had a good time over a few weeks there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was a good tournament because it was interesting games. Coach K's farewell tour ended in horrific fashion. I mean, sure, that's a dub if you ask me. So I'll take. Yeah,
well, all you need to know is one shining moment had missed shots in it, and not just one, multiple missed shots.
Yeah,
and sad Coach K, and it's like, okay, there was nothing really uplifting or positive about it, and that can be interesting too.
For sure. And Bill Self, just another example of they tend to struggle when they are supposed to be better than whoever they're playing. Right. I know that sounds like a weird statement, but when you put it into context, they win the national championship. If you go back, that Mario Chalmers team probably they weren't favored against that Memphis team.
So that was like rolling. A pick 'em. Yeah.
Right. But that Memphis team came in, they lost I think, one game that whole year.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And what was my other guy's name on that team? CDR, right? Chris Douglas Roberts. That was that same squad with Derrick Rose. No? Do I have that mixed up? Anyways, the point being,
I wasn't prepared.
Yeah.
I wasn't prepared for my Memphis Tigers 2007. Right.
Either
roster.
Way. Point being that, sure. Congratulations, Kansas. Good win. Bill Self not having his team ready to start a national championship game and then drawing up a terrible play at the very end. Whatever. Not surprising. But yeah, March Madness over for yet another year. Can't wait to do it all again next year because it's always so much fun. But as March Madness ends, some more madness begins as we now switch gears to the NBA, and the NBA is really, really, really picking up, and they have a bit of their March Madness of their own, obviously on a lesser scale.
Yeah.
But I'm a fan of this play-in tournament thing because it means that you still get to watch games night in, night out that matter, right? And I was plugged into that Nets game last night as the Nets were down big to the Knicks, and they're not just going to cave and just give that game up because they want to not be in the 9 or 10 spot. They want to be in the 7 or 8 spot. Right. Yeah. So there's so much more at stake for that Nets team. So you're watching them down and you have Kevin Durant on your team and you're going to come back and beat the Knicks and somehow still cover 7 points. I don't know.
Yeah.
How. But last night, NBA favorites, 6-0 straight up, 5-1 against the spread. And it was weird because, the Suns cover 7 +7, and the Suns were playing literally nobody. They played everyone the night before so that they could officially eliminate the Lakers from play-in contention, which was just hilarious. Yeah. Everyone sits and they lose to the Clippers after trailing by 39 points. They come back to cover the 7, which was just an insane just whatever. That's only people gambling are watching that game because why are you watching the Suns without Chris Paul, without Devin Booker, without anybody playing, without DeAndre Ayton against the Clippers?
Yeah.
But anyways, the Mavs, but then you look at the other games in which the favorites covered straight up, and you're talking about the Mavs covering 9 points, the Nets covering 7, the Hawks covering 10.5, Celtics covering 7.5 against the Bulls as that trend continues. And we were all over that from way back when. Fade the Bulls against good teams. And even the Utah Jazz covering 15.5 points against the Thunder, which shows again something we talked about on the last pod. Some teams are trying, other teams are in 1-2-3 Cancun mode. And if you can highlight those things, you can win some money down the stretch in the NBA, because it's even more apparent now with the play-in tournament that you can just see who's trying and who's not trying. And I think that's like, when you're gambling and looking for value, that's the thing that you can win some money off.
Yeah. We talked on Monday, right? Because there was no NBA games. It's like, okay, well, let's sort of kind of go big picture, but we singled out 2 games on Tuesday. And one of those was Washington plus 11.5 against Minnesota. Now, we didn't mention that the Wizards were going to win 132-114 over the Timberwolves. Like we didn't have the 18-point win on the money line there, right? The 29-point cover for the Wizards. We were just saying like, okay, but just because there's reason to win, right, for the Timberwolves, as in like, okay, they could move a little bit in positioning, right? I went on an elaborate like Panama, Canada soccer rant or example. Just because there's a reason to win doesn't mean like that's actually motivation translated on the court, right? That doesn't mean like the shooting guard on the Timberwolves is going to be like diving on the floor just because, oh man, we got to get that extra spot in the standings. Like, no, actually we're in, like, we think we're a professional team. Like we think we can win anywhere we need to play, especially when we look around, see some of these matchups that we might have, not stressed out all about it. Right. It's not like it's even the last game of the regular season. Okay, we'll win the next one, blah, 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 blah. Right. And so you end up getting an easy winner there. We talked about Portland mega 1-2-3 Cancuning it, right? As we have a couple of these teams jockeying for position for the first overall pick, but there's no sort of like,
I saw a video of Dame Lillard and his family. Like Dame's making like Instagram Lillard family TikTok accounts and doing like exotic dance routines with this girl. And it's just like, what is happening right now? Like the season is going on. Your team is getting blown out like night in, night out. Yeah. So you guys can add Chet. Like that's really what we're doing out here.
That's the thing. Yeah. Like, is there like, they're clearly, we haven't found a rhyme for anyone, right? We don't, there's always a guy and then we have to rhyme something, the tank for,
losing bets for Chet.
Not bad.
That was off the top of the dome.
Staying home for Holmgren. I don't know.
We'll work on it.
We'll work. Maybe we don't workshop that live on the podcast. And then like Oklahoma City, right? We're like, why would you ever lay points with Oklahoma City? And it almost didn't work out, but like -3.5 ends up getting there by a half point against Portland. But it's like, you don't need to know anything about these teams, right? You can just sort of look and go like, okay, like this team is still competing. But here's the other end of the spectrum, right? It's like, you can try to, guess on this a lot of the times, and you can end up with the Knicks +7, and they have a 17-point lead at halftime. And you go, okay, like you've made a really good bet, but they're still going to knickerbocker all over you.
And I say it all the time, that clip, that meme of I'm Kevin Durant is one of the greatest things in the history of social media. Because It's just, you're watching that game and it's like, yeah, it's 17 points. But as you said, it's the Knicks.
But if you're the type of person to be sort of deep into the NBA to the point where you are picking out these spots like Knicks +7, and we'll talk about this here in a little bit with a couple other different examples here going forward. But like, yeah, we know the Nets are needing to win. Like this is the most clear-cut example of a team that's going to want to win, because again, we'll go into the standings and see how some might, be tippy-toeing their way up the standings, and some, might just not want anything to do with that. Like the Nets are the cleanest example of like, okay, we want to win. And so when you see that they go down 17 points to the Knicks, and there is a full 24 minutes of basketball, and like however you want to paint the Knicks, like there's reason to like the Nets in a possible live betting situation, right? And so there's a difference between, and listen, the Nets went and covered anyway, and that's sort of the irony in all of this, but there's a difference between needing to win and needing to cover, right? Sure. And so like, yeah, betting the Nets live there is a completely viable spot because they need to win the game, right? There's no reason to bet on the the Timberwolves minus 11.5, the, even the Nets -7, even some of these other teams, right? Even Atlanta, minus 10.5, right? Because they don't need to win by that many points. Now, even Atlanta and Washington, that's a tie game, at the end of the third quarter. Right. And so you're feeling probably pretty good about yourself if you had faded the idea of Atlanta being overvalued. Now, it just so happens that these teams make this push in the end. And I think that's the angle, is that come the third quarter, if it's, or even halftime, if it's a 17-point deficit, or come the fourth quarter when the game is close, like which team at the end of the game is going to put that push on. And so if you've created yourself a decent bet early on by grabbing Knicks +7, by grabbing Washington +10.5, and now the live line is, the live line, it's the Nets and the Knicks. The live line might have been pick 'em at halftime, with a 17-point deficit. Like, that's how little we sort of think of the Knicks. Imagine that they were probably at least favored by a few buckets, but that's the point where you go, okay, like, we know we're getting a push here from the Nets. We know we're getting a push here from the Hawks, because that is the cleanest need to win situation there is here. And I think it frames everything else that happens throughout the rest of this week. And so, you sort of tip your cap to the Nets for ending up, covering that game. Same thing with the Hawks, right? But if you had bet that game and were watching that game, right, like, the situation changes, right? Like, when you have those leads and you have those live betting opportunities, like, that's where you want to step in using the using the motivation angle, right? You don't want the motivation angle when you have to win and cover a high number, right? Sure. It's like Colts Jags. Now, I use Colts Jags from the last game of the season because it's like the purest example of when all of this goes wrong, because you could bet the Colts, at halftime, thinking that you're going to get a push. But there's a difference between the NBA and the NFL, and that's possession numbers, right? Like, in the NBA, you're going to get so many possessions to turn up the screws defensively, to run better stuff, to make more shots offensively, right? Whereas in the NFL, you're only going to get 5 possessions on either side. And so you have like such a smaller, just a smaller opportunity to be able to take advantage of, right? The other team being way, way worse, or maybe being checked out, because as much as there's value on those teams at +10.5, at +7, and that's pretty clear by where those games were sort of, midway through the third quarter, there's still the idea that like these other teams need to win, want to win, and maybe they're not locked in in the first half, because, they show up and they're like, oh, we're going to beat this team. And then like, we're going to have a game later on in the week that maybe we have to, focus in on a little bit harder. And then they wake up and it's tied at halftime, or they're down 17 at halftime. And they go, oh, okay, like, maybe we should actually like really lock in here. And that's where you're going to get that motivational angle. So I think it's very much more of a live betting angle in those circumstances where they're not just blowing out the opponent. Now, in these teams, you got the Magic, right? Who, like the Pacers have turned 7 wins into 7 losses in a row into 8 losses in a row. Like, yeah, okay, those teams are probably going to get blown out from the jump, right? But when we point out to teams like Detroit, like the Knicks, like the Wizards, who haven't necessarily packed it in, at least from a start of the game, they're just bad, right? Like, it's not an effort situation. It's just a not being very good situation. So those are the teams that you want to like bet early and fade late against some of these, teams that really need to win the game.
For sure. Totally. And as you look at the NBA standings, things are getting super interesting because the jockeying that goes on, you mentioned, right? The Nets go from being in 10th all the way up to 8th. And, you're looking at a game where they're down 17, and also the Hawks also involved there last night as well in a crazy game. That those two teams are tied right now. And obviously the tiebreaker going to the Nets at this point, but that's a huge, huge, huge tiebreaker in the sense that if you're in 9th, you have to win 2 games to make the playoffs.
So right? What is the tiebreaker? Like,
I'm pretty sure it's head to head.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the first tiebreaker is head to head record.
Okay. So the Hawks will need to have a better record than the Nets, which of course last night, right? You're sitting there going like, oh my God, the Nets are going to lose this game. And the Hawks are going to get that sort of, nose above, if you will. Right. Yeah. So, okay. So that's interesting to me because we're getting into these last few games here. And obviously the Nets need to pass the Hawks for 8th. Otherwise, the Nets are going to be the 8th seed, right? That's assuming they even win those games.
Yeah.
So
The other part that's interesting is the Cavs, right? So the Cavs end up falling. I'm not positive off the top of my head who has a tiebreaker between the Cavs and the Hawks, right? Like that's an interesting one because I don't know the answer to that. Like off the top of my head, I'm sure I could look it up, but either way, my point is the Cavs are in trouble, right? Like the Cavs have been spiraling downhill for a while now. And if you fall all the way down to like 9th,
right,
it's just, that's tough sledding for a team that you went from such a like happy-go-lucky story for the whole season to just falling off a cliff at the end. And I mean, even if them coming in 7th and having to play against the Nets in that play-in game is even worse, like you would almost, and I know this might sound crazy, but you would almost rather come in 9th, right?
Right.
Play the Hornets, win, and then hope that the Nets have already won, right? And then now you have to play, like, would you rather play 2 games against the Hornets and Hawks, right? As opposed to playing 1 game against the Nets to make the playoffs? Right.
Well, yeah, especially if you're on the road to the Nets, right? Like, what's your odds, right? Because your money line, like, what's your money line going to be on the road to the Nets? Right. And then what's your 2-game rollover parlay going to be with a home game and a road game, I guess would be against, I mean, in theory, the Hawks, right? Like, it might, the Nets money line might be higher than that. I'm skimming through. And I mean, before we even get to the idea of playing the Nets in the play-in game, who are they playing on Friday? They're playing the Nets. So like the Cavs literally have to go to Brooklyn on Friday. And so when you look at it and you go, well, they're 1 game up with 2 games to go. Like normally that's still like a decently safe spot. You're like, okay, control your own destiny, da, 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 da. And it's not that they don't, they still do control their own destiny, so to speak. The problem is they are literally having to go to the Nets, right? Like it's the worst possible situation for the Cavs.
This is why this play-in is so good though, right? Like how much more important, like there's so many more stakes riding on that game as opposed to just what it would normally be, even with these 2 teams being 7 and 8, even if it was just normal playoffs and they're both in the playoffs and you're battling for seeding, like in terms of it being, you're battling for seeding, which means a home game in this play-in tournament and then not having to lose and then play another game to make the playoffs. Like, I don't know, people who are against the play-in tournament, I get it. I guess you just don't like fun stuff. I just don't understand the arguments against it. Right. I don't know, but that's just
no, that's fair. I'm just looking at it. And by the way, right. Cavs and Nets 1-1 so far this season against each other. So not only is it, not only the game for the Nets to get to even with the Cavs, they're also getting the tiebreaker by winning that game on Friday. So like obviously massive repercussions there.
I see that as being the Kyrie game where like, Kyrie's been going for 50 here and there. Like he'll pick and choose his spots. Like that's definitely going to be a game where I could see Kyrie being like, don't worry guys, I got us tonight. Going for 50 against his former team.
Possible Kyrie over points. I like it.
Just to be like, hey guys, don't worry, I got this. I did think though, and to give credit where credit's due, I think it was Simmons and Russillo. I was listening to them talk about how the Kyrie Irving getting all these 50-point games and how like everyone's applauding him, but it's like, yeah, you're resting like half the season, right? Like you're playing like 2 games, you're playing like 2 games a week for the whole season. Of course, you're going to have a lot of extra juice when you haven't played in like 4 days, right?
He comes in, he's just zooming around people. You're like, where do you get all the energy? It's like, well, not playing for 6 months.
Back-to-backs. Kyrie's like, what's a back-to-back? I don't even know what that is. Never heard of it.
No. It's absurd.
But yeah, that's the Eastern Conference. And if we go up to the top of the Eastern Conference, the interesting thing to me is, and we'll get to the picks for tonight. So I got some picks for tonight's games. We'll get there in a sec. But the interesting thing to me is the Celtics are now currently in the 2 seed, and they are half game up on the Bucks and 76ers. That is very interesting because obviously coming in the 2 seed now, 2-7 would be that matchup. Presumably that 2-7 matchup would put you up against the aforementioned Nets. But you look at it, and we talked about this last week, right? Where who's going to be ducking the Nets? And we didn't really see the Celtics as being that team. We don't really see the Bucks as being that team. The Sixers I mean, at first I thought they were ducking, but now they just might not be good. So I don't know what the difference is there. But with these games, and hey, we'll get to it. I have a pick for the Celtics Bucks game tonight, but
okay.
What kind of would be the strategy here going forward? Like, can you even have a strategy with how close things are in the play-in tournament? Like, what would you do if you're the Celtics? What would you do if you're the Bucks? What would you do if you're the Sixers with a couple games left?
Yeah, that's what makes yesterday's game, like the Knicks, if they had just won that game, that's what, that would have turned this into, honestly, I think we would have way more sort of a betting opportunity here because, again, let's sort of work backwards, right? Let's work under the hypothetical that maybe the Nets don't get aren't playing in the 7-8 game, or somehow they lose that 7-8 game, right? Like, let's say they are in the eighth seed, like which half of the Eastern Conference bracket would you want to be in? Would you want to be in the Miami, Brooklyn, and then Toronto, and then one of Boston, Milwaukee, or Philly, right? Like right now it's Philly. Like I wouldn't want anything to do with Heat, Raptors, Sixers, Nets. Like that's a brutal side when especially the other side is, again, under current standings, the other side is Celtics, who, like, for all of the success they've had in the second half, right? There's a lot of sort of bullsy type stuff in there where there's like, they're winning a lot against these sort of worse teams, but like, okay, we're going to give Boston a ton of credit here, but like Boston, Milwaukee, and then the other two teams are like Chicago and Atlanta, or Chicago and Cleveland, right? Like, so you want to be in that 2-3 zone. Now, again, that was sort of under the premise of Brooklyn being in the 8th spot. Now that Brooklyn could be more likely to be in the 7 spot with a win over the Cavs. Now you go, okay, so now they're in the 7th spot. You still have Chicago in the 6. What happens if Boston loses down the stretch here, loses the game tonight at Milwaukee, and now all of a sudden they end up in the 4-5 game. And now you're looking at Heat, which, it's funny, like the Heat look a lot more impressive when that grouping is Heat, Nets, Philly, Toronto. But when that group becomes Heat, Hawks, Boston, Toronto, right? Like that looks like a softer, group there where kind of anything could happen. I wouldn't, I shouldn't say, like, it wouldn't be crazy for the Hawks to knock off the Heat. It wouldn't necessarily be all that crazy if it ended up being like, I was going to say the Cavs, but I guess that would be pretty crazy if the Cavs beat the Heat.
Hawks
to
Hawks. The Hawks are.
Yeah. But I mean, like the Hawks at least made the conference finals last year, like as sort of crazy as a thing that, actually happened is like, it, that wouldn't be the most insane thing to ever kind of happen. So, obviously the Nets then winning here, but the interesting thing to me, and like, you have a pick on this game, and that's I'm absolutely going to bet on that once you give it out. But to me, I'm looking at this game on, I believe it's Friday here, and that's Atlanta and Miami. Because, like, what does Miami want, right? They want to get the Nets they'd love to get the Nets out of everything. You know what I mean? So, like, knowing that they might have to face the Nets in the, in a 1-8 type of a game, normally you look at this and you go, okay, like the Heat, they don't really need anything. Like, what are you going to, what do you want to do? Like, it's almost now getting to the point where they're going to want to win that game way more than they ever would before, right? Like we went from, oh, maybe we'll just sort of tank this one over to the Hawks because we want, the Nets to be in that 9 seed type situation, right? Where it's like you can try to manipulate things here a little bit. Now it's almost the reverse because of that game last night with the Knicks, where now it's like, well, maybe we should, maybe we do need to try against the Hawks, get this team bumped into a 7-8 game and get the Nets onto that other side of the bracket, get them into that 2-7, 3-6 side of the bracket, right? And so, like, I mean, whatever happens tonight obviously has to do with the 2-3-4 area. But to me, the interesting game is going to be on Friday and how the Heat treat what the Hawks need. And it's almost like the Heat are going to play with the Hawks and put the Hawks wherever they want the Hawks to go. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like that, I think over the course of this weekend where, there isn't a ton of matchups that are like jumping out at us as far as this team's going to tank it, this team's going to, you know, try to massage it. And a lot of times it's massaging it so that like the team in question can fit in a certain spot. In this case, when it comes to the Heat, it's like, all right, how can we move the Hawks around like a chess piece in order to best suit our needs, when trying to avoid the Nets? So I think that one's going to be sort of the big game of the weekend.
Yeah, I think, and we've said this from the get-go too, right? I think Heat, by definition, they're not really built that whole we're not trying thing. Like, yes, Jimmy Butler didn't play when they came to Toronto, but we've seen all season long their record of being first in the East is based off of never having all of their guys available anyways. So just because someone's sitting doesn't necessarily mean, hey, we're like packing it in and handing this game over, right? So definitely super interesting for sure in terms of how these standings are going to shake down. But as always, as mentioned, always want to try to get to some picks. And we're on a very interesting run here, an 8-1 run in terms of picks on the pod. So let's try to give 3 more. And as always, what we try to do here is we're making these picks at around 9 a.m. in the morning, which means obviously it's the NBA. So injury reports could come out at any point before tip-off and alter these lines or alter who's in the starting lineup. But as of now, here are the picks. If certain guys, certain stars aren't in the lineup, obviously adjust accordingly, people. Use your discretion. But in terms of tonight's action, we got the Sixers at the Raptors in a pick'em game. I just love the Raptors in this matchup. Raptors at home. I know they are on the second night of a back-to-back. Totally get that. But they also have too many guys to bother James Harden. There is some talk about maybe Nick Nurse might decide to give Freddie a night off, Fred VanVleet a night off, who's been a little bit banged up. So keep an eye out for that as the day progresses. But if everyone is in the lineup for the Raptors and everyone other than Matthias Thybulle, who we'll get to in a sec, not in the lineup for the Sixers, it's just a bad matchup for the Sixers. When you need James Harden and Joel Embiid to both go off for your team to be successful, and the Raptors have just a lineup of 6'9" dudes just to harass James Harden and make his night just a living hell. We saw this a couple weeks ago. It's a tough matchup for the Sixers. Give me the Raptors in a pick'em game. Wait and see what ends up happening with the injury report as that comes out. Also, no Thybulle for the Sixers is huge because that's one less person that they have to throw out there to try to guard one of the Raptors 6'9" dudes, whether it's Scotty Barnes or Pascal Siakam. But yeah, the other part is this could obviously be everyone healthy, a sneak peek, a first round preview. And I'm going to tell you right now, if that's the case, take the Raptors to beat the Sixers in the first round of the playoffs.
I was going to say you are
April
all
7th.
You are all about this Raptors Sixers potential matchup. The one thing that I have an issue with just for this game, and I almost sort of want to, not push against it necessarily, but
yeah.
You mentioned Fred VanVleet getting a night off here. Like the Raptors don't really have anything to play for here.
Totally
right?
true.
And there isn't what's the reasoning to play, using Fred VanVleet as an example, but I mean, pick a guy. I mean, obviously he's sort of maybe the most veteran one of a relatively young group. Like, what is the motivation to, sort of push him into the lineup or sort of minutes or all of that sort of thing? Like, this feels like a game that if the Sixers win, we might be getting more value on the Raptors next week. Do you know what I mean? And because we just talked about there is some value here potentially, again, more moving parts than we hoped for, but there is some value in the Sixers moving up and being in this 2-3-4, and even honestly, when you're looking at the 2-3-4 and you go, okay, I don't know about the first round, how this is all going to shake out. That 2-3-4 is going to make a difference come the second round, right? You want to be in that 2 seed in order to have home court, because as much as we talk matchups and all of that sort of thing, home court in the NBA is still the most important thing in kind of all of sports, right? From at least a home field, home ice, home court advantage type of a situation, right? So I just worry that the Raptors are going to easily kind of just dump this game because They don't need it. Like, again, the difference between 5 and 6 is meaningless because, again, we don't know who 2 and 3 are.
Yeah.
And it's not like the Raptors are headed for a Eastern Conference Finals matchup with the Bulls. Mm-hmm. So it's not going to matter from a home court standpoint because they're never going to see the Bulls. I shouldn't say never, but highly unlikely. Yeah. And it wouldn't be, I guess it would be the semifinals, right? It would be the second round. But, the point is like, we just talked about motivations and the idea that like, okay, like jockeying for a 6-7, a 5-6, what's the difference there? Like, there just isn't much. And so I would be a little bit worried that they are going to sit Van Fleet because it just doesn't make any sense for him to play in this game or really many of these games, over the course of this weekend. Yeah. And so, I kind of hope that he doesn't, and maybe it sort of, changes things as far as wanting to bet this game. And then maybe the Sixers win the game because, the Raptors show that, we're not really caring all that much about this game. But a week from now, that'll be long forgotten because it's not, on people's radars. It's not a focal point for people. And so they'll just look at the record of the Raptors. Well, the Sixers just beat them last week in Toronto, like blah, 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 because we're going to get plus money on the Raptors in that series, assuming that series even happens. Now, again, the irony is, of course, right, if the Sixers win the game, it puts them that much closer into not being the 4 seed, right? They become, it becomes closer that they're the 3 or even the 2 seed, and this whole sort of conversation is moot, which, is where we are when it comes to this whole NBA last weekend and all the jockeying.
Yeah. And I mean, a couple extra things here just for context with this game, right? Like these two teams played in Philly on March 20th, I think it was, somewhere around there in Philly. Fred VanVleet sat out that game in Philly and the Raptors won against Embiid and James Harden, right? So like the Raptors, it's kind of like, and I hate saying this, making this comparison because Raptors Twitter is an insane place. But it's kind of like heat culture type of thing where like they don't really know how to have gears. Do you know what I mean? Like the Raptors, the Bucks, like those teams, like even if someone is sitting, like they're just built, like Nick Nurse is coaching them like extra, like they don't know how to downshift, right? So even with, it's one of those things where you can know, hey, Fred VanVleet's not in the lineup. That adds value to the Raptors. The line probably shifts more in the Sixers' favor in that sense. There's still value there for the Raptors because they are just a team that is going to be, pesky and bother the Sixers and make this game hell for the Sixers, right? And, I don't know what's going to happen in terms of Fred VanVleet resting, but I do know that, well, obviously you look at the schedule, they play tonight and then they play tomorrow night against the Rockets. Yeah. So, second night of a back-to-back, maybe against the Rockets, maybe that's your opportunity where you rest a bunch of guys, right? And Freddie probably, knowing Nick Nurse, they're probably going to want to play him in one of the games, would be my guess. So I don't know. It's like, because there's two ways to look at it, right? Do you save them and just let them get a sweat against the Rockets tomorrow, and you don't want to play them against the Sixers because you don't want to give them too much tape, let's say, in case that is the first round matchup? I don't know. There's so many different ways that this could go. But if you're telling me a pickup game, Raps at home against the Sixers, let's go. Give me the Raps in a pick'em game. It's just a bad matchup for the Sixers. And I mean, if I'm being honest, I'm fading the Sixers, whoever they're playing come playoff time, because I just think the way that they're constructed, they don't have enough depth. Joel Embiid's going to have to go for 40 a night. And can he do that? I mean, I got to see it first.
Yeah, listen, I think you're right. Like from a playoff standpoint, right? Like I'm, when we talk about like all hands on deck matchup, then we talk about value and like what the series price is going to be. Yeah, you're right. I mean, listen, the Rockets on the second night, the one thing that I would be worried about is like that feels homecoming game ish to me, right? It's the last regular season game. Yeah. Right. And so it's like, okay, would you rather just sort of, again, not because you make a good point, right? They're never just going to give a game away, but obviously, like the Raptors lose value when Fred VanVleet is not in the lineup. And if they end up being like 6.5 point underdogs or something, the line gets way over adjustment, then that's a different conversation that we're having too, right? And there's also a different situation between like, okay, he's not playing, but like we still have stuff to play for, versus he's not playing and the rest of us don't really have anything to play for because we clinched our playoff spot, no play-in tournament, blah, blah, blah. Like that letdown element. And then knowing that you've got Houston coming to town for the last game of the home game of the regular season, it's like, I'd rather just kind of have all my guys there for the Houston game. We'll win comfortably. Everybody will get their ovation coming out of the game, right? It turns into sort of senior night in college basketball where, there's a bunch of timeouts late so that we can all applaud, guys, that sort of thing. To me, there's a lot of variables there that like, I like it. It's almost, I wish this game wasn't happening so that we could save the Raptors bet for next week and not sort of burn one of those bets on a game that has like high variable type stuff, right? Like there's a lot of moving pieces, and that's why I don't bet a ton of NBA in the regular season, because there are a lot of moving pieces, and I wait for the playoffs, or I wait for games that we pinpoint on this podcast where it's like, okay, these are the spots to sort of dip your toe in and get out. Like this is just one that like I would personally pass because there are too many guesses when it comes to this, but I understand your full sort of handicap of it where it's like, no, the Raptors are a bad matchup for the Sixers. And like, I am going to hope that that's the matchup in the first round. And at that point, that's when we're going to swoop in and do some damage on that series, I think.
For sure. And I think the most likely scenario is the Raps will split it and they'll sit some of their, like you look at their main guys, right? They're going to sit some of those guys tonight, and then those guys will play tomorrow, and they'll just flip flop. Yeah. Right. Like that's my guess.
Yeah.
But
you got to know who those guys are, right? Yeah. You got to know who those guys are before you can make this bet.
Totally. So so we got the Raptors in a pick'em game. Second game, Celtics at the Bucks. Bucks favored by 6 points. Celtics on the second night of a back-to-back. The Bucks chilling at home and waiting. Celtics a half game up on the 2 seed. But in the 2 seed, as we discussed, right, means a potential meeting with the Nets, or 3 seed, meaning you could face the Raps or the Bulls. So again, I'm trying to guess who really wants to play, who's even looking at the standings, what kind of that mentality is. I will say the Celtics' new coach, I feel like he's breathing life into this, like we want the smoke type angle, right? So like, I think both teams will be quote unquote trying, for lack of a better term. Like Giannis doesn't know how to not try. So to me, I look at it just the Celtics on the second half of a back-to-back on the road. Give me the Bucks. It's a lot of points to be laying, and I don't love laying that many points. I will try to in game and, get a better number, a lower number than 6. But in terms of right now and what I try to do, make a pick against spread, give me the Bucks -6 on the second night of a back-to-back for the Boston Celtics.
This feels like Bucks absolutely hammered the Celtics tonight. And I'm going to say that because, you mentioned like, both teams are sort of trying here. Are they? Because like from an organizational standpoint, right? Like the Boston Celtics, they are wily AF, right? Like they are going to try to, speaking of teams that are going to try to massage things down the stretch. And I think what last night's game does is it sort of, obviously doesn't take them out of contention for the 4 seed, but it certainly gets them a lot closer to a 2 or a 3. But when you look at it, right, like the highlighter, circle it, underline it, whatever, is the Bulls in the 6th spot, right? Like the 3 seed is a very desirable place to be. And like you can go to Milwaukee, lose this game and not have anybody say a word about it, and have Milwaukee take the 2 seed. And by the way, if we're going to talk, next time we're going to have, with the exception of play-in tournament matchups, we're basically going to have seeding set and matchup set.
Yeah.
Gimme Bucks Nets 2-7 in the first round, like all day, every day. Like, yes, please, whatever you got to do to make that happen, right? And I think the first step of that, obviously, is Bucks winning this game tonight, right? To go a half game up on the Celtics and sort of be able to kind of, as we say, control their own destiny. At that point, the Celtics will only have 1 game left. And so there's only so much the Celtics will be able to do. And they'll have at least banked a win here. I'm going to quickly grab the schedule here for the Celtics to see what their last game of the season is. But I just go, okay, like, it's like the Bucks, I don't want to say they don't know any better, but like they're not going to tank a game at home against the Boston Celtics, right? Like that just isn't a thing that they're going to do. And it's at Memphis is the Celtics' last game, which is very interesting. How much is Memphis going to care about that game? That one is a mega up in the air type of a situation when it comes to the Celtics. So yeah, like I think, I think the Bucks right now, because they're looking at it and they're going like, oh, I'm not convinced the Nets are going to be the 7th seed. Let's just win a game against another Eastern Conference contender here. You know, you and I talked about how the Bucks are getting locked in here in this last month stretch of the season, last few weeks of the season. You know, obviously that win against was Philadelphia or Brooklyn, I can't even remember. Yeah. And so, yeah, I just think this is a spot like Celtics sort of low key, just kind of maybe toy with the minutes a little bit here and like, you know, don't have that late game push, whereas the Bucks absolutely do. I think 6 is a little, it's not short necessarily, it's a fair price, but given the circumstance here, I think it's getting drawn sort of down because we think that this is going to be a heavyweight tilt, whereas I think one team's going to be pulling their punches here a little bit. So I love your pick there. I think you should be even more confident in it than you are. I like Bucks -6 here a ton.
Yeah. And to wrap things up here, the last game, it's the Lakers at the Golden State Warriors. And I'm going to be really honest here. I just want to make fun of the Lakers because they are done. It's 1-2-3 Cancun mode. We talked about LeBron quitting down the stretch, and he most definitely did quit on this team down the stretch. Woj has headlines circling on ESPN about Vogel coaching his last days in LA. If you're someone on the Lakers right now, how are you not booking your trip to Cancun right now? Maybe Cabo, right? But either way, you're not focused on this game against the Golden State Warriors. LeBron, if I'm not mistaken, is on the shop talking about he wants to play with Bronny, but the other dude he'd like to play with is Steph. Like, what is happening right now, right? So like,
just too much.
The Lakers, LeBron's not going to play. Anthony Davis probably isn't going to play. Russ probably isn't going to play. So it doesn't matter who's playing for Golden State. The rest of the Lakers are in quit mode, right? Yeah. So give me 12. I don't like laying 12 points, but again, I just want to make fun of the Lakers here. So give me the Golden State Warriors -12. And to recap, yes, Warriors -12. Give me the Bucks -6 and the Raptors in a pick'em game. Those are my picks here for Thursday night's action in the NBA. Hit me up on Twitter.
I got a couple for you. And it's really more just a, listen, a lot of times, we're betting for fun. That's the whole point, right? Like that's why people bet. I happen to be trying to make a little bit more money than maybe more people, on average. Interesting sort of a case study here tonight in some of these, also ran type of games. We just talked about Minnesota and the idea like, okay, they have reason to win, but like, do they? Mm-hmm. And San Antonio, right? They play San Antonio. San Antonio is an 8.5 point underdog. And meanwhile, you have the Pelicans and Portland. And we talked about Portland and Damian Lillard's up to, no good on the socials. That's a 16.5 point spread to the Pelicans. And like some of that has to be on this idea that the Pelicans, quote unquote, need, want, somewhat desire, whatever, a win. Like 16.5 is too many against a Portland team that like, yeah, I get it, man. Like they're probably not going to win this game, but you would have said the same thing about the Wizards against the Timberwolves the other night, right? Like we're talking about the margins and these games that, again, the Pelicans don't need to win by 17. They only need to win this game. And needing is obviously a bit of a stretch as well, because they are not going to catch the Clippers, right? They're only potentially going to get caught by the Spurs. So now you're saying like, yeah, but they won a home game in the 9-10. But this is exactly what we were talking about when we pinpointed the Wizards Timberwolves matchup from Tuesday. It's like, yeah, they can do that by winning by 10 points. They can win that by winning by 14. They can do that by 16 points if they want to and still not cover. And when we're talking about point spread betting and needing a 3% edge on something, right? 3% is the difference between winning this game by 17 and winning this game by 15, right? This number should be 14.5 or 15. It's not, it's inflated because obviously we have this sort of distrust for the Blazers because they're 1-9, but they're not necessarily getting blown out in every single one of those games. And certainly not to a team that, by the way, like the Pelicans, like I know we throw a line in the standings because like this is a team that's not in the play-in tournament. And then this is a team who's only play-in tournament worthy. And then these non-play-in tournament teams are absolute garbage. And there's a line that the Pelicans are above right now, but the Pelicans are 35-44. Like, yeah, I know they're 7-3 and they're sort of gotten it going late or whatever, but this is still a 35-44 team. Like maybe it's a 500 team, like sort of when, if we project going forward, right? This is a team that has a minus 0.9 point differential. Like it's just an average team. And like, yeah, Portland stinks, but like, 27-52. I realize a lot of that was on the front end. Certainly 1-9 in their last 10 is not ideal, but like 16.5, like that's obviously inflated because of the idea that the Pelicans want to win this game. And of course they do, right? And they're not going to lose this game, I don't think, right? But again, I wouldn't have thought that the Wizards were going to beat the Timberwolves, which brings us to the Timberwolves, right? Timberwolves locked into their spot.
Can we hold here on the Blazers and Pelicans for a second? A couple things. One, I would not advise anybody to bet on the Blazers plus whatever the points are. The Blazers player to watch, like, you know how it's like players to watch, you know, they'll give you the little thing. I've never heard of Drew Eubanks before in my life. Like I don't know who that person is. And when you look at the lineup that they threw out there against the Oklahoma City Thunder, a game in which they lost to a Thunder team that had Roby, Horde, Kalazikis, Simpson, and Krejci. And I don't think that's David Krejci. I don't even think I'm pronouncing that name right. That is who they lost to, the Thunder, because their lineup consists of my guy Ebanks, Brown the third, Dunn, Ellaby, and Johnson. Don't know who any of those dudes are on the Portland Trail Blazers. They are in full-on tank mode against the New Orleans Pelicans team, who's still living off this new car smell since it got new life from trading for former Portland Trail Blazer CJ McCollum, who has brought in new life into the team. And that's kind of why they're on the run. That's kind of why they're playing a bit better now. That's kind of why, you know, there's a different feel for the New Orleans Pelicans as of late. And while I would never lay 16.5 points in any basketball game, I'm definitely not going to take the points.
Well, okay, but
Ebanks.
It's easy to sit. It's easy to sit on the sidelines, man. Like, it's easy to sit on the sidelines and be like, I wouldn't do either. Like, if you wouldn't do either, then you're saying it's a fair price, right?
No. If you had a gun,
because if it's not a fair price, but if it's not a fair price, you have to bet it. You have to bet it if it's not a fair price.
If you're forcing me to bet it, I'm betting on CJ McCollum and the Pelicans,
right?
Which is because like they're gonna lose by like 25 points in this game. Like,
well,
I don't know.
If they're gonna lose by 25 points, then you have to bet it, right? Like, that's the point. Like, the line is either fair or not fair, and in this case, right? Like, if you don't want anything to do with minus 16.5, that's fine. Like, you don't have to bet it. Nobody's asking you to bet it. But the reason you're not betting it is because you think it's fair, because you don't want minus 16.5, but you also don't want plus 16.5, right? Like, that's okay. Like, you can want neither of those, but don't you think that, like, I mean, listen, everybody does the whole thing, like the sports books and the casinos in Vegas aren't built on the idea that everybody is just cashing every bet, right? Like, at 16.5, like, that is too many points for a Pelicans team that is just frankly not that good. And if it isn't, I'm not saying it's a guarantee.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that, like, we're talking about 53-47, right? When it comes to percentages here.
Totally. But sometimes, like, especially in basketball, right? Like, the spread, like, a team can lose by 30, but they would never make the point spread 30 points because nobody is going to make that bet. Right.
Of course.
Like, the point spread could be 25 and nobody would make that bet. The Blazers are going to lose by like 30 points in this game.
Right. Okay. And that's fine. And you're going to be right. The 30-point thing, you're probably going to be right about 20% of the time. Right. Like, it's, you know, it's a bell curve, right? Like, in the peak of the bell curve is where the point spread should be. Right. Yeah. And no, the point spread was never going to be Wizards minus 10 the other night, but they went on the road and they won. And, like, the Wizards aren't exactly, like, you know, crushing it here. Like, this, you know, these are all teams that should be sort of in tank mode to improve their draft position, et cetera, right? Like, that's not the point. The point is that the Pelicans can succeed by winning this game by any amount of points. They do not need to win this game by 17 points, right? The point is that the Blazers are probably going to score the last basket in this game. So you are going to need the game to be 19, 20-point lead. And is a lot of the time that going to be the case? Yeah. Absolutely. Right. But that's not what we do here. We don't do the, like, okay, like, you just have to blindly bet against this team that, by the way, like, for whatever, you know, listen, you don't know the names of the guys. I get that. Like, there is a thick, speaking of bell curves, right? There is a thick middle of basketball playing humanity that could all be in the NBA. Like if you just think that there's some, again, speaking of invisible lines, if you think there's a line where it's like NBA player, non-NBA player, and there's a difference between that player and the other player, there isn't, right? There are 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 players who could be in the NBA, but we have to cap it somewhere, right? We see, you know, there's only so many spaces that are filled. And if there's 12 per team and 30 per whatever, and there's 300 whatever team or 300 whatever players in the league, like there aren't 350 good players in the world. There's probably 3,000 good players in the world, right? But it's a matter of opportunity. So yeah, all these guys are getting their opportunity. And honestly, this is what would make me like the Blazers more, because if it was just Carmelo Anthony and Russell Westbrook and the like dregs of society that the Lakers are going to run out there, who have no reason to care about this game because their reputations and their legacies are already set, or you've got a bunch of guys that like, yeah, because we don't know the 1,200 best player in the world in basketball, doesn't mean that like they aren't good enough to compete in a basketball game where there is no motivation for the Pelicans to win this game by 17 points. Like they could, right? Again, there is a 20 whatever percent chance in the bell curve. Once you hit 17 or better, that's a very reasonable possibility, right? And like your concept of like they're in tank mode, blah, 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 like all of that makes sense. But if they were in such a tank mode where the players on the court were in such a tank mode, then the game against Oklahoma City wasn't going to be competitive, but it was, right? And these two teams played a couple of weeks ago, and it was a 10-point game, which like for whatever, you know, however you want to say it, right? A 10-point game is a competitive game in the NBA. And so like the point isn't, is this something that's definitely going to happen or definitely not, right? And like, yeah, there's a better chance that like that the Pels win by 30 than the Blazers win, right? Like obviously, but that's what the pricing is for, right? That's why the money line is different than the alternative spread. And if you want to hit the alternative spread for minus 29.5, absolutely do it. I wouldn't even be against that, because if that's how you feel about it and you can get better odds, absolutely. But we're talking about minus 110 on either side, right? And so we need to beat 52.5% somehow. And over the course of this game happening 1,000 times, unfortunately, it's only going to happen one time. So it's going to happen in one of these range of results. In the same way that if the T-Wolves and the Wizards played tomorrow, the T-Wolves might win by 30, right? Like that's what variance is here. I'm just saying that if they play this 1,000 times, this game is getting covered 530 times. Right. It's also getting not covered 470 times. And maybe that's what happens in that game tonight. I don't know. Right. And like, and they also get blown out 100 times out of 1,000 times, or maybe even more than that. Right. Like there's obviously a variable here, but like, that's the point. That's what we do on a weekly basis, whether it's college basketball, NFL, college football, NBA, hockey, whatever. It's we're playing the percentages here. And so like, yeah, it would fit the narrative a lot better if the Pelicans just absolutely hammered the Blazers beyond sort of belief here. But like the players on the court are at least going to try for the Blazers. And that's a little bit more than I can say for some of these other teams, right? And it's just standard operating procedure that when you see an inflated line that you, I shouldn't say have to bet it, but like it's a good idea to bet it. Now, again, good idea to bet and the Blazers all in the same sentence. Okay, I get why that's uncomfortable. But as you and I talk about, the most uncomfortable bets are the ones that we should be making, because everybody lines up for the comfortable bet, right? And that's why the line is what it is, because if this line wasn't fair, it would be higher, because people would probably still fade the Blazers at minus 17.5, minus 18.5, minus 19.5. Right. But they're not. Now, maybe this ends up closing 18, 19, whatever, right? Because we have a full day of betting. I don't know. Right. All I'm saying is like, to me, from my betting existence, I much rather take all those points knowing what I know about these two teams versus laying those points knowing what I know about these two teams, as sort of as minimal as that is. And I don't even mean them specifically as far as player personnel is concerned. I just mean situationally what is needed here and how a sportsbook is going to line this game, because you are never going to get a good price in fading the Blazers, right? It is not a secret that they are 1-9 in their last 10, and it is an L fest down the board. But the point is, it can be another L on the board. And then a lot of that chunk of that bell curve is covered by them covering this game.
No, totally makes a lot of sense. And the Portland Trailblazers, yes, that will be a very interesting matchup for a lot of different reasons as they wind out the string here, trying to pick up a high draft pick in said NBA draft. But yeah, with a lot of games going on and a lot of things to look at here in the NBA down the stretch, we'll obviously be back on Monday to pick things up. There'll be some playoff matchups that will be set. There'll be some playoff matchups that will be set, and obviously the play-in tournament will be set. We'll know what those teams will be and what those games will be. We'll be back with some picks for that on Monday. But in terms of enjoying the weekend ahead of sports, where there are a lot of sports still to gamble on, where can the people follow you, man?
Yeah, at MRuss Authentic on Twitter. I'll be sweating garbage time in Portland and New Orleans. That's going to be electric. Speaking of guys we never heard of, I can't imagine who the Pelicans will have in when it's a 15-point game with 2 minutes to go in that one. Sort of got off track there, but San Antonio plus 8.5 is the other one that I'm looking at, right? And the difference between motivations, right? Pelicans would like to win, but would need to cover 16.5 in order to win us a bet. Whereas San Antonio, right, they're the team that they're competing with. San Antonio needs to win. And so you go, okay, well, should we be fading San Antonio because this whole like inflation concept? Well, no, they're 8.5-point underdogs against a Timberwolves team, right, who just, as we've mentioned 100 times, lost to the Wizards. So plus 8.5, obviously different, right? You're going to get the effort from San Antonio to keep that game close. So plus 8.5. And that's why there's a difference there between that motivation concept, right? Do you need to win and how much to buy and what, and how that matters. At Emrys Authentic on Twitter, going to have live betting for the Masters. You and I are going to have to do an online sort of discussion about what, where these teams are over the weekend. Is there going to be any valuable bets? I'm hoping to see something coming from you. Oh, Saturday, like this team's whatever and blah, 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 blah. Should we hit this, that kind of thing? Because yeah, like you mentioned, man, we're going to get a bracket, right? We might not get all of the matchups, obviously, with the play-in tournament, but at least we're going to have a functional bracket that we'll be able to analyze on Monday. And I can't wait to do it because I'm pumped about this playoffs because I think it's going to be one of the better ones, especially in the first round, than we've had in a really long time in the NBA.
Yeah, it'll be a lot of fun. And thanks again for joining us here on the pod. We'll be back next week. Thanks a lot, my dude.
Love it, man. Thanks so much.
Then if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Don't forget to like and subscribe to DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also rate us, review us, like us, all that other fun stuff. But for more from this new project from DRF Sports, just a little reminder, if you're unfamiliar with the letters DRF, it stands for Daily Racing Forum, which has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now we've taken over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, college sports, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has all of the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, team stats, and more. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want access to all of the raw data, drf.com/sports. That's where you can find the usual previews as we deep dive into the games. And of course, got you covered on this podcast. However you want your betting information, we've got you covered. Again, my name is Sheldon Alexander. That's all I got for now. But until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.